Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to A Date with Darkness podcast. I have a special guest for you today, and I wanted to talk a little bit about narcissism today. When we talk a lot about narcissism, we don't talk about other elements of narcissism or what can be included with narcissism. So I brought on a guest today that can talk about what is called the dark triad. The dark triad is a theory which talks about three negative personality traits and possibly considers a fourth. And those are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy with a consideration for sadism. So this show is a little bit more, how should I say, it's a little bit more of an informative show. So, we try to definitely break it down so that people can understand. But I think in order to truly understand narcissism, or pathology, psychopathology in people who are abusive or commit crimes against persons or, just dark personalities, it's important to understand these different elements. And so I have a guest who is here to talk about his research on those elements, Dr. Virgil Zeigler Hill. And without further ado, here's our interview. Hello and welcome to the show, Virgil. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
I am super excited to talk with you. So for the listeners out there that don't know who you are, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Sure. So my name is Virgil Zeigler Hill. I'm a professor and director of graduate training at Oakland University. I'm a social personality psychologist, and the vast majority of my work focuses on really three areas. One, I do a lot of work on personality processes and structure, so things like narcissism, psychopathy, spitefulness, those sorts of things. I'm really interested in kind of the more aversive or darker aspects of personality. So I look at the nastier side of human nature. I also do work on relationships, particularly romantic relationships, as well as self-esteem as well.
I like that a lot. So we have a lot in common there. Tell me a little bit about what excites you about the darker sides of personality.
So the way I kind of got interested in that through kind of the back door, if you will. What I became really interested in, what started my interest in psychology more broadly, what was self-esteem. And so my graduate work was very focused on how people feel about themselves and how people think about themselves. And my interest in kind of the darker aspects of personality really came about from what I thought would be a single study that I would run in my doctoral program, where I was interested in looking at what's referred to as fragile self-esteem. So the sorts of fluctuations, for example, that people experience in their state self-esteem over time. And I thought that there was a lot in common between narcissism and these sorts of indicators of fragile self-esteem, like instability. So I thought, I'll run a single study looking at narcissism, showing that it's connected with some of these indicators of fragile self-esteem, and found out that the world is a lot more complicated than I thought it was then, and eventually fell in love with the idea of narcissism. And then from there, kind of expanded out some of the other really aversive aspects of personality. So my interest was, I became interested in narcissism indirectly through self-esteem.
Tell me about some of the darker sides of personality.
Sure. So there are a number of different ways to kind of chop
Sure.
things up. But one of the really popular ways is there are three components referred to as the dark triad of personality. With narcissism being one of those, psychopathy being another, and Machiavellianism being a third. Some people have argued that sadism should be included in there as a dark tetrad. I've done work on spitefulness, and some people have argued that maybe that should also be considered as one of these dark aspects of personality. I don't really have a strong stance on whether spitefulness and sadism should be included. What interests me about all of them is that they all share this antagonistic element. And I think sometimes when people in this area of the literature, when they start arguing and debating about things, I think sometimes they start to miss out on this key common core that they all have, which is this high levels of antagonism or really low levels of agreeableness, and then kind of different kind of flavors, if you will, of antagonism that really kind of emerges.
Can you tell us about the differences between the three from your perspective?
Sure. So with they all have different sorts of areas of commonality and differences. When and things get a little bit even trickier beyond that, because some of the assessment tools I don't think do a great job of assessing what they're supposed to be assessing.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So for example, what the assessment tools that are commonly used would sometimes show is that narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism all have an element of impulsivity to them, where people who have these sorts of characteristics tend to act on their desires really quickly. My problem with that is it makes sense for narcissism and psychopathy, but Machiavellianism is not supposed to be an impulsive construct. And so I think what's happened is that with regard to Machiavellianism, in certain areas of the literature, people have started to kind of let the tail kind of wag the dog, so to speak, because the measure of Machiavellianism becomes what Machiavellianism is, instead of recognizing that sometimes the measures we use maybe aren't really capturing the construct as well as we would like. So to get back to your question, so we've got narcissism, which has to do with this idea that people really do have a positive view of themselves. And what some of my colleagues and I have been arguing in recent years is that issues concerning status really play a pivotal role in understanding what narcissism really is about at the heart of the matter. In the past, people have argued that narcissism is about self-esteem regulation. And I think that argument is off base. And I think instead the connection between narcissism and self-esteem really has to do with issues of status. And what self-esteem is doing is it's tracking certain things for us. For example, it tracks how much respect and admiration we think we're getting from the environment, which is where the status aspect comes in. And narcissistic individuals care a lot about their status. I would argue that's kind of the defining feature, if you will, of narcissism. Psychopathy, I think when you boil it down, I think one of the easiest ways to understand psychopathy is it really has to do with kind of this form of selfishness that's almost predatory in nature. And there are some commonalities with narcissism, but I think the predatory nature of psychopathy is what starts to distinguish it from narcissism. It really is, among the so-called dark triad, it really is the most aversive and toxic of the three. And then Machiavellianism really has to do with this sort of strategic approach to kind of gaining power and influence. And people, one of the really interesting things about Machiavellianism is that these folks are willing to kind of adopt more of a long-term perspective to get their goals met. Now they're willing to meet their goals using relatively pro-social and cooperative strategies if that will work for them. But they're also willing to resort to using fairly antagonistic and aversive approaches if that would be the best avenue for them to meet their goals.
Can you draw a picture of what a person would look like demonstrating these three qualities?
Sure. So part of I very glibly said sure, but let me back up and give a little more nuance to that.
Yeah.
So part of where things get complicated is
Mm-hmm.
with all three of these broad personality constellations. They're all multidimensional in nature.
Yes.
And so when we start kind of decomposing them, we get kind of different aspects or
Mm-hmm.
features of narcissism. Same thing for psychopathy, and same thing for Machiavellianism, although Machiavellianism is a little messier in some ways. So with narcissism, the I would argue the best model is one developed by Josh Miller and his colleagues. And what they argue is that you really have what's referred to as this kind of trifurcation of narcissism. So you've got narcissism at the highest level.
Mm.
You can then start decomposing that into grandiose and vulnerable narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I think Josh and his collaborators did, which is really, really helpful, is they argue that below that, you can then separate it into a form of extroverted narcissism, which is kind of purely grandiose, this sort of neurotic narcissism that's
Mm-hmm.
purely vulnerable, and antagonistic narcissism, which has both grandiose and vulnerable elements. And what's really nice about that is that prior to that, people had looked at grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, but sometimes they would find a fair bit of commonality between them in terms of patterns of correlation with other constructs, how people responded to things, to events in their lives. And a lot of the reason for that appears to be that both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism have this antagonistic element that I think Josh and his colleagues did a nice job of kind of distinguishing that for the first time, really. So somebody with this extroverted sort of narcissism is going to be very self-promotional. What I think is going on, the data is not terribly strong, but what I think is going on is that those are the folks that probably see themselves as doing really well in the status hierarchy. So if you see yourself as being up near the top of the status hierarchy, maybe you do a lot of self-promotion. People with the antagonistic aspect of narcissism tend to be really aggressive and antagonistic in their interactions with others. They tend to be, they experience a lot of envy of others. And when they experience envy, they're very focused on bringing others down to their level. And so it's a very competitive sort of world for these folks. And I think in terms of status, I think these people are probably somewhere kind of in the middle of the status hierarchy where they want to continue ascending, but they're having trouble kind of doing that. So they're willing to kind of scrape and bite and claw if they need to kind of get above their rivals. Now, the other thing that I think could be going on with those folks is they could be a bit higher in the status hierarchy, but afraid that they might fall down at some point in the near future. And so I think these are the folks that just tend to view the world as being a really hyper-competitive sort of place. The people with the neurotic form of narcissism, they tend to be very experience a lot of negative affect, a lot of negative emotionality. Their self-esteem tends to be relatively low. And those are the folks who I think are probably kind of low in the status hierarchy and don't see a lot of hope for themselves to really kind of ascend it in the near future, even though they have these sorts of grandiose fantasies about kind of being up at the top. With psychopathy, it's kind of a similar issue where there are different aspects of psychopathy. Different models are certainly popular. I think probably the best model currently is this model that argues there are three distinct dimensions to psychopathy. One is this sort of meanness element that really is the kind of aggressive, antagonistic sort of issue that we've talked about with narcissism. And I think there are some similarities there, this sort of callous presentation. There's also an impulsivity element that really is crucial to psychopathy. And then, and most people most researchers in this area will agree that meanness and impulsivity are almost certainly part of psychopathy. And you see those elements in almost every model of psychopathy. The controversial part with this model is that it also argues that there's a boldness element. And part of what makes that so controversial is that boldness doesn't show up in some conceptualizations of psychopathy. So, for example, if you look at antisocial personality disorder in the DSM-5,
Yes.
you can see some of the meanness elements, you can see the impulsivity. Boldness, this doesn't fit as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at assessment tools, boldness usually has a very different pattern of associations with outcomes compared to the meanness and impulsivity element. And so it just looks very different. One of the things that I think is a potential area for future research and growth is that a researcher named Scott Lilienfeld, before he died recently, was arguing that to understand psychopathy, it may take looking at these three elements and looking at the interactions between them.
Yes.
What he was arguing is that different kind of aspects of psychopathy may have an emergent property. So it may be that when you blend kind of these kind of meanness elements with the boldness elements, you get a particular type of psychopathy that I think is a really interesting approach. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of research so far looking at that. What has shown up, I would argue, probably has had mixed results at best. But I think there's a lot of potential going forward for something to really, for someone to come along and really try to really maximize this sort of emergent property approach to psychopathy. And for Machiavellianism, it also has multiple dimensions. The thing that I think is probably the most important characterization for Machiavellianism is that it really is about strategic thinking. It's about people who are willing to take whatever avenue they need to reach their long-term goals. And they don't mind behaving well with others and cooperating. If that will get them what they want, they're perfectly happy to do that. They're also willing to step on others if they need to get where they want to go. But it's long-term strategic thinking. And one of the issues that I think has come up in the literature is that some of the assessment tools for Machiavellianism maybe weren't put together as carefully as they should have been. And as a result, what we get is what people are referring to as Machiavellianism often has a really impulsive element to it that creates a lot of overlap with psychopathy. And so what happens now is that there's an argument about whether Machiavellianism is even a standalone construct because of its fairly substantial overlap with psychopathy in a lot of studies. And I think the problem there is more on the measurement side than it is on the conceptualization side. And I think some of the measures that we think are measuring Machiavellianism are really measuring something more akin to psychopathy. And so I think it becomes a very kind of confusing mess, unfortunately.
I would agree with that. And just as you're talking and, just kind of having worked in corrections and seeing, very extreme versions of these, it's just kind of interesting to hear you talk about it because it's like, whereas you might not agree with the boldness component, I feel like I do because it's like, oh yeah, you see that so clearly, but I would also agree that maybe certain conditions have to be met in order for that to really show up.
Yeah, I love the idea of trying to integrate boldness into the way we think about psychopathy. I think it's a really interesting approach, and I love the idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, at the end of the day, you know, when I think about if I think about which of these three would I rather run into on the street, and which of these three would I really want to avoid, I would definitely want to avoid psychopathy. And I think that is just such a scary, scary personality to work with. And I also think, and having worked with it, I also think that there's levels to it. Some people are much more extreme, just like narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. You're going to have various levels to it. But, regardless of what level of psychopathy, to me, that's always been just such a scary person. And just in talking with them and knowing how they think and the things that they want to do, and how this is normal, like breathing.
Right. Well, and I think that's a wonderful point that I failed to mention, is that all these things are really probably best understood as continuous dimensions, where
Hmm.
all of us fall somewhere on these dimensions. Some of us are a little bit lower on extroverted narcissism, some of us are a little bit higher, but we all fall somewhere on these sorts of dimensions, and they really start to become problematic when you especially for these sorts of aversive qualities, when you're getting up on the high end, like being really high in kind of the meanness element of psychopathy, probably not a pleasant individual to be interacting with. I completely agree.
Yeah, and I would agree too in terms of the boldness. I feel like there's something about the boldness component changing because, as you know, they have the capacity to just sort of blend like the everyday person, but then there's like this other side to them, like night and day, and this shows up in court, this shows up in everyday situations. So I do think, regardless, there are different levels, and just, yeah, I do think there's some sort of switching that can happen with these folks. Well, thank you. For folks that want to connect with you, this resonated with you, or they want to hear more about you and what you're doing in your research, can you tell us how we can find you?
Sure. So probably the best way to look at some of the research I've been doing is my website. It's zeiglerhill.com, zeiglerhill.com, or you can send me an email at zieglerh@oakland.edu.
All right, awesome. And thank you so much for coming on and enlightening us about this topic.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, would love to know what your thoughts were on the interview with Dr. Virgil Zeigler Hill, and what you may have taken away from this episode, if you've seen elements of the dark triad in someone, and what that experience has been like for you. So let me know what your thoughts are if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're seeing our post on Instagram or Twitter. Make sure you leave a comment down below. Would love to know what your thoughts are. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well. Check out the sneak preview of next week's episode.
Yeah, I mean, it was a website about hatred. It was not about nudity. It was not about pornography. It was about bullying. It was about ruining lives, trying to get people fired, trying to drive people to suicide. The group called themselves the Family. So it was like a cult, like a Charles Manson type of language they used. And the owner of the site called himself the father, and the followers were the children. And sometimes the children would say things like, "I will kill for you, father. What do you want me to do?" So it was very cult-like, and really a despicable place, and horrible comments made about many of the nude pictures, calling people fat, a whale, ugly, picking apart their bodies. So, but yeah, my daughter saw one of her friends on the site and found out that she had been hacked, just like my daughter had been hacked. And that's why I thought to myself, it's pretty bizarre that I only know 2 people on this site and both have been hacked. So I assumed there was probably a hacking scheme.